We'll now move on to our next panel, which focuses on misogyny, harassment, and violence based on gender and sexual orientation. Now, chairing this panel is Tamara Thermitus, who's a visiting scholar at McGill Center for Human Rights and Pluralism. So, Tamara, I invite you to turn your camera and microphone on, and over to you.
Is it on? Okay, yes. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, to be honest, it's not morning anymore. So I have a privilege to chair that panel. So I will be very brief and start to present all the panelists. So I'm going to start with Dr. Jaigris Hodson, is the Canadian Research Center in Digital Communication for the Public Interest. SSHRC and CIHR found research examined the way that misinformation can be mitigated through digital communication effort, particularly those targeted at the research community. Thus, our current work examines such interdisciplinary topic as educational intervention to address COVID-19 related misinformation, online harassment of diverse researchers, the discourse of conspiracy theory, and the ecological approach to understanding misinformation in the modern context. Hi.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yes, and I would like to present Kaitlynn Mendes. Kaitlynn, your camera is not on.
I know, I'm sorry, I can't, it's not letting, oh, there we go. Hi. Okay. Sorry about that.
Good afternoon, Kaitlynn. So Kaitlynn is the Canadian Researcher Chair in Inequality and Gender at Western University. She's an expert on issues around sexual violence and digital technology, including how technology exacerbates the issue and how people create use of technology to fight that. Ever increasing technology development and sexual violence rapidly taking on new form, Dr. Mendes' research helped prepare young people for their digital future. She worked with a range of stakeholders to develop resources for school to tackle this issue through relationship and sex education curriculum. She's the author of 60 publications, including the award-winning book, Slut Walk, Feminism, Activism, and Media, and the Digital Feminism Activism, Women and Girl Fighting Back Against Rape Culture. Good afternoon, Kaitlynn.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to having you, and we're like looking forward to to the discussion. Dr. Emily Laidlaw is a Canada Researcher Chair in the Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law of University of Calgary. She researches in the area of technology regulation, cybersecurity, human rights, with a focus on platform regulation, online harms, privacy, freedom of expression, and corporate social responsibility. She's the author of the book, Regulating Speech in the Cyberspace, Gatekeepers, Human Rights, and Corporate Responsibility. She shares also the Expert Advisory Committee group, online safety for the Heritage Ministry in 2022. So good afternoon, Emily. So
hi, thanks for having me.
So without delay, because we're a bit off time, so we're gonna start with you, Jaigris, if you can share your thoughts about the subject, and after that we're gonna go to Kaitlynn and Emily.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, absolutely. I'll try to stick within the 5 minutes. I want to mention that I want to mention that I'm calling in today from the ancestral lands of the Lekwungen and Kasepsin people here on Vancouver Island, and I'm very grateful to be able to be here today. Now, if you've been watching the news this week, you probably noticed that Elon Musk has decided that on Twitter, the word cisgender is now going to be considered a slur, and that people who use the word cisgender on Twitter will be banned or otherwise disciplined. And I think this is just one example, right, of what the previous panel talked about, and these far right discourses that are trickling in to these online spaces in very major ways because Elon Musk is the owner of Twitter, right? And if cisgender, which is the descriptor term, is now considered by people with right-wing interests to be something like a slur, then that is evidence of how important this gender-based violence online is becoming as a matter of concern for all of us. Now, I'm involved in several research projects that look at gender-based technology facilitated violence and abuse online. And we've been looking at mainly in the context of science communication, especially post-COVID, because what people are telling us is that when they go online to communicate about science, communicate about public health, or communicate about their research, which are things that we need to know, right, to fight back against this rising tide of polarization, they are targeted, and they're targeted deliberately as a mechanism to silence things that people don't want to hear. So it would be, silencing maybe science about COVID. It might be silencing any feminist research that people produce, or it might be silencing women and gender nonconforming people who dare to speak out about research or science just because they are located in gender nonconforming or female bodies. And that is a huge deal, because it's not just about speaking out as a tactic against information that people disagree with, like the term cisgender, which is bad enough, but it is also, you are not allowed, right, to say what we think you ought to say. Only maybe men, white men usually, only men maybe are allowed to be scientists, or only men are allowed to talk about their research in public. And this is huge, right? Because as you can see on this panel, imagine if we were all silenced here today, or the previous panel. Imagine if we lost all of these voices from the discourse, right? That would be huge and terrible. And people who are exposed to this kind of online violence, they have many sort of responses to it. People think, it's just online, right? No big deal. You get that response a lot from law enforcement, a lot from the managers of people who work in fields where they have to be online. Oh no, it's just online. It's not real, but it is real. And effects can include things like feelings of anxiousness and distress, to burnout, to economic impacts because people can't work anymore. People have difficulty sleeping, they experience depression, etc. Very real and meaningful impacts. And then people lose confidence in their ability to do their job. They're losing confidence to speak out online, and they often withdraw from online, or they tell us that they withdraw from these online platforms. So when we say that there's a potential loss of these voices, that's not an assumption. That is people telling us that they don't want to share maybe their research online anymore because they have been targeted. And that's like such a big deal for people. They're withdrawing to prevent those personal consequences like burnout and depression. But then we're losing democratic communication, or the opportunity for democratic communication. And when we ask people about what they need for support, when they're going through something like this, they tell us they need support at all levels. They need their friends and family to step up and help them block, etc. But they also need their organizations to understand that this is a real problem, and to support them, with maybe IT support, or just, support them by saying, yeah, I've got your back when somebody, calls your boss, with an angry call because there's a campaign against you. Sometimes they need security, right? Because they've been doxxed, their information has been leaked to the public. Often they need the platforms to step up in ways platforms aren't, right? People need the platforms to take it seriously. And as we can see with the Elon Musk example, platforms are doing the opposite. And then, of course, they need to be taken seriously by law enforcement and legal laws as a whole. And I think what we're learning today, even with the first panel, is this also requires a cultural shift. It requires a shift in the leadership that we see in Canada and how these things are handled, and who gets to be considered to be a full citizen and to be taken care of. And unfortunately, that's not quite happening yet. Most of the people that are getting supported is only at that individual level. It's only maybe friends and family stepping up. And the other levels are just, being left, right? And when we talk to organizations about this, they're aware that the problem exists, but they're stuck in a punitive framework. And they think if they can't punish an anonymous person online, then that's the beginning and the end of it. So even though people are asking, crying even for support, they're not getting support. They're being told, well, you know, it's anonymous, it's online, so we can't help you. Call the police. When calling the police might even not even be appropriate, right? For maybe people in racialized bodies, for example. So we have a long way to go to address this issue. And this is becoming an acute issue that we do need to address. And I'll end it there because I don't want to take too much time, but thank you very much.
Thank you for your input, Jaigris. So I would like to go to Kaitlynn, if you can share with us what you think, and it will be interesting to discuss because there's a lot to unpack, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Jaigris, that was wonderful to go after you. And, you know, there's so much of what you said that I think I could unpack further. But to say I agree. And, you know, I started researching or started coming into this topic of studying online harassment almost 15 years ago when I was looking at how feminists started using digital technologies to talk about feminism and challenge rape culture and misogyny and sexism. And initially, they started telling me about negative online experiences. You know, even when they first started telling me about this, we didn't have the language of trolling. We didn't have the language of online harassment. So they were just talking about these negative things. And over time, as I started talking to more feminists, I realized the ways that actually the kind of like what Jaigris was saying, the more people are speaking out or using technologies to use their voice, the more pushback they're getting, the more anti-feminism, the more backlash. And again, it really differs depending on if you're racialized, if you're disabled, in terms of your migration status. So there's lots of intersecting factors. But today, nowadays, I'm doing a lot of research specifically with young people and their experiences online. And what I'd like to do today is have a provocation, which is that I really want us to stop thinking about misogyny and harassment and gender-based violence as being either on or offline, but recognize the ways that it's post-digital. And Jaigris, you were really getting to this, right? So that we cannot understand these acts as simply happening on or offline, or that their impact can be diminished by, say, turning off your device. Misogyny and harassment that comes to you via digital technologies impacts you as you move around the world. And harassment and abuse in online spaces are often, or in offline spaces are often filmed and uploaded, and they're shared in these online spaces. And that's what's happening these days. So really what I've been trying to do and you know, do some research with Jaigris, where we're really trying to push forward this term technology facilitated gender-based violence, and using that instead of talking about online harassment or online misogyny. And the use of this term tech-facilitated gender-based violence helps us to recognize how contemporary violence transcends these on and off spaces. And it may also help us with the policymakers and the organizations and the educational institutions, the police, to see that harassment, misogyny, and abuse, no matter where it happens, is problematic. It needs to be addressed. So many times, just like what Jaigris was saying, we hear groups suggest that just because it happens online, it's not that serious. It's not harmful. It's often kind of categorized as cyberbullying. You know, it's really not that serious. It's something you just need to get over. But we know from research that I've done and others have done that tech-facilitated gender-based violence is widespread. So a recent study I did in the UK found 78% of young people aged 13 to 18 experienced at least one form of it. Another colleague I work with named Susie Dunn had a report that was just released last week that was looking at 18 countries in the global south. It was a study with 18,000 people participating, and they found 60%, these were adults, that experienced at least one form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And we know, even if we kind of unpack these figures further, that gender, diverse, and sexual minorities, racialized groups report the highest incidences. So I think we need to better understand how tech-facilitated gender-based sexual violence differs depending on these intersecting identity characteristics as well. Now, I want to also kind of touch upon something Jaigris did, which is about the supports. We also need better supports that are founded by empirical data. So I think it's wonderful when I see people like Jaigris, you know, going out and talking to people to find out about their experiences. What are they doing? What are they experiencing? Where are they experiencing it? Again, Jaigris, what you're talking about in terms of the platforms, we need to be holding them much more to account. We need to have levers so that we can, you know, encourage policymakers and government to not just say, let the tech companies do what they want, they'll do the right thing, because they won't and they aren't. The research that I did with young people in the UK found that 65% of them do nothing when they experience tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And that was really worrying. And a lot of them also reported things like anxiety, depression, self-harm, school refusing. It has serious consequences. So we need decision makers, policymakers, legislators, educators to be making their decisions based on evidence. And to do that, they have to go out and talk to people. So really, this is also a call to go out and do more research. And maybe I'll just finish by saying the consequences of tech-facilitated gender-based sexual violence are real and like Jaigris pointed out, and they are damaging. And this is something that isn't going to go away as technologies continue to evolve and develop. I think we need to really pause and think about the role that AI is playing. You know, technologies can be wonderful, but they can also be tools that are used for harm. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Would you like, Tamara, you're muted, but I can start.
Mute. I'm sorry. So Emily, it's your turn. Like, yeah, let's go on.
Yeah, thanks so much. And you know what? I was nodding along because, you know, I agree with everything that's been said. So this is gonna be a really fun conversation, and I'll complement it with I will keep this contained, but a legal discussion of this, because I'm a law professor, and so I focus on, well, what is the role that the law can play in providing a solution? But, you know, the reality too is that this is an all hands on deck scenario where we need technical solutions, corporate governance, education, better resourcing and training of law enforcement, and so on. So it's all of it working together that's going to address this issue. There's a lot of mistrust of government right now, but we do need government to be leading on this. And so let me just start with a few examples that come to mind that really bring home the severity of the abuse we're seeing here with, you know, as Kaitlynn was saying, tech-facilitated gender-based abuse. Internet of Things technologies are being weaponized in domestic abuse scenarios. They're creating this kind of environment of perpetual fear. You know, you think of ex-partners that can remotely turn on and off lights and lock doors and track movements. Apple AirTags are being used to stalk women, not just to try to track your bags that are, you know, being lost by the airplanes. Amazon was just fined by the Federal Trade Commission. So an employee was watching recordings of female users of Amazon Ring, you know, that security camera. So the videos were of intimate places like bathrooms and bedrooms. And Kaitlynn mentioned AI. So generative AI is making it really easy to write and launch abuse campaigns, but also to just pollute the environment with misogynistic information, all kinds of other extremist information. Essentially, what I've been talking about is mind hacking, right? That is disrupting and interfering with our freedom to be able to form thoughts without manipulation. It's easier with AI to create deep fakes that we know the stats that these are generally targeted when it's intimate images at women. On social media, there's been a massive uptick of abuse of transgender individuals, attacks of female and intersectional journalists and politicians. And it's brutal. And I think that both were talking a little bit about that in different contexts. Leading up to my comments here. It's causing profound harm. It's driving individuals from participation online. And we all know that we need to participate, you know, or use technology, I'd say, not to thrive and succeed in the world. It always makes me think of this. There was this case that involved Twitter stalking. And I mean, the facts of the case maybe didn't, I don't know, rise to the level of being criminal harassment. But I thought the most disturbing remark of the judge was the idea that the women involved who, you know, subjectively were feeling harassed, the answer was they should just leave Twitter. They should just not use that space, which the idea that, you know, you should go away when it's happening to you is deeply problematic. And so discussions about how strengthening harassment laws actually provide more equal and open spaces for discourse is an important conversation. So what do we need from law? So I did want to pause a bit on this. We do need more creative solutions to work with the individual nature of each product and service. So it is really hard to write laws here because of the fact that it's so specific to the different types of tech that we're dealing with. Also, the legal obligation should exist at the design phase of these products and services and requires ongoing monitoring by the company. Basically, we need product safety. I think privacy and data protection laws, they need work, but they're already geared in that particular direction, but not everything is a privacy breach. So social media regulation, platform regulation at the moment does not impose this kind of due diligence or duty of care type framework. This is the model that's just been adopted in Europe with the Digital Services Act. There's a bill in the UK that is going in this direction. And I think this is also where Canada is going to go. Hopefully we'll have legislation proposed soon. There's good and bad of these different approaches, but it's the idea that there's a duty of care, that companies do need to be responsible corporate actors. One challenge I think for law is that a lot of what we're talking about here is lawful but awful. You know, it's harmful, but it's legal. You know, we see the massaging of attitudes on gaming platforms, the role of recommender systems, sort of facilitating going down these different sort of rabbit holes of content. You know, think for a moment about incel communities. You know, we know that these groups help embed and legitimize belief systems. Some of what's posted is illegal, perhaps some of it's threatening, but most of it is not. And the law does not deal well with that kind of situation, and it does not deal well with collective threats, right? The way that it's just like women are being collectively threatened here. And we're seeing this in other types of extremism online as well. We are seeing, of course, real world attacks like in Toronto and LA that are being fueled by, say, incel ideologies. But the most we can say is that these groups are maybe decision shaping, not decision making. Like, it's hard to make some of those connections in terms of having a legal intervention, right? So from a legal perspective, you ask, well, what kind of, you know, can you impose obligations on messaging apps to monitor private group chats or other social media to moderate these different groups? Well, there's huge privacy implications. And I think to the idea that you'd have a general obligation to monitor, there's a reason why the law has said flat out, no, that's an issue, because it ends up backfiring and end up often targeting the groups that you're looking to protect. I think some of the knee-jerk reactions we see is, well, you should just shut down certain groups or take down particular content. But again, it doesn't fully work in practice. You know, you see content moderation policies being weaponized, you know, by brigaders that are actually targeting particular marginalized groups. I also think, and these are kind of the last two comments I'll say before I open this up, is, I mean, I'm usually solution oriented, so I don't say all this as a criticism as though there isn't an avenue forward. I just think that we have to be very careful how we do it to achieve our objectives. I think for too long, cybersecurity has been treated as a technical issue. You know, it's just about confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of data. You know, think of the Amazon Ring example that I gave before, or AirTags. You know, technology builds and shapes our social and cultural structures. So product safety isn't just about keeping Amazon Ring data protected from just unfettered employee access. I mean, you could just say that's what happened in this case. But another way to put it is to say, well, Amazon had an obligation to analyze its product and identify specific vulnerabilities and threats to its users, in this case, women, and take steps to address it. And that's a very different way to think about cybersecurity. And the last point I think I'll make is that, you know, the law operates in silos, and that is not going to work here. So privacy, artificial intelligence, competition, platform regulation, consumer protection, national security, like, it's all connected. But it's been really hard in law to sort of just build this framework with this evolving tech environment when generally it's all operating in different silos. And I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
So I think that we're going to build on the idea of silos, because for me, you talk about diverse silo that the law operate, but also there's also the criminal aspect that is you didn't raise. What are we going to do? Because the fact is that in reality, as you say, it's misogyny, but it's also misogyny noir, the fact that the Black woman and minority women and Aboriginal women are more targeted. But at the same time, we face organizations which have a not great understanding, neither on misogyny, neither on racism, neither on the situation of Aboriginal people. So the 8 online built under 8 as a 8 in the society as a whole. So the problem for me, from my perspective, and I can be wrong, is that there's a bigger problem, and online is a byproduct of our problem that we did not dealt with. So I will open the conversation with that.
I mean, I'll jump right back in, take advantage of being the last speaker. I 100% agree, and it makes it really difficult to address this, right? So, and this came up in many of the conversations I've had about, well, how do you create online safety legislation that is victim-centered? I get really frustrated when comments are made that, well, we have a law, we have a crime of hate propaganda, and I'm just like, yeah, but you need to think it through. The particular groups don't want to go to law enforcement. There have been very, as you say, problems with law enforcement and attitudes to these particular groups, but also just the lack of resources for them to deal with these issues, lack of training. Often when you talk to children, and I'm sure Kaitlynn could talk about this, but they don't want to deal with a lot of these issues through the police. So it's not an effective mechanism. And so then I sit and I go, okay, you're an individual and you're sitting at home and something horrific has happened to you. What is going to provide you the kind of solution, and who do you want to go to, right? I mean, in the area of intimate images, what you need a lot of the time is you need a support system. You need someone, and that you were talking about support earlier, to help you navigate what has happened to you. And we did this exercise with the Uniform Law Conference of Canada, drafting an intimate image legislation. And it was to make it a speedier, easier access to just a legal mechanism. But let's be clear, we had limits on what we could do. We could just create a streamlined court process to really help victims. You needed that backed up with, is there some sort of victim support offered that helps them figure out the system and what to do? Figure out if it's even legal, what they want, how they want to deal with it. Is there other ways you could resource schools? I mean, when we talk to teenagers, they're like, well, we want to go through schools, but like 3 counselors in a high school of 3,000 people that also deals with like university applications, that's not happening. Anyway, I'll leave it there at that point, but I agree, but it makes it so, I mean, it's interesting, but it also makes it so difficult, doesn't it, to deal with.
I don't know if I can jump in, because I think there's also a real issue of what people understand about the law, and a lot of misunderstandings about the law. And so one of the things, one of the projects I'm doing here in Canada with a number of colleagues, one of my colleagues, Alexa Dodge, is always talking about how, young people, if you go into schools, the police, their teachers are always telling them, like, never send intimate images because you're going to get charged with child pornography laws. Whereas in reality, that's rarely ever actually used. And so thinking about, well, I think you're right in terms of young people fear going to the police. They fear going through laws, and I think they're worried. I think they also don't understand what the laws are. They don't understand what supports are available to them. And I think adults also don't understand as well. So maybe just I'll say one last thing. So Nova Scotia, you probably know of this, Emily, but they have something called CyberScan, which developed after, the really tragic suicide of Rehtaeh Parsons, but it's really about saying, hang on, we recognize people don't necessarily want legal remedies to some of these issues. They want the support, exactly like what you were talking about. And that's kind of a key outcome, is we need to develop other forms of support for young people that aren't necessarily the law. And we know, especially when it comes to women, around sexual gender-based violence, the law rarely actually provides justice. It rarely satisfies their justice needs. And so there's no reason to think that if we're dealing with technology, that it would be any different. So again, we need to think, I think, creatively about what kind of other supports and what does justice look like for someone who's experienced tech-facilitated gender-based violence.
Yeah, I'd love to follow on that. Thanks, Kaitlynn, because I think you're right, that we also need to think outside the law, and the support piece is huge. Like in one of my projects, we talked to people who manage, basically researchers in a university context, and they were well aware of misogyny and how that impacts the fact that certain people are going to get targeted for online abuse way more than other people, and it will have huge impacts to already marginalized faculty in their career. So that was great to see. Like they knew the problem existed, but then their answer, nobody will be surprised by this, their answer was, well, we need to send it to police. We need to send it to, we need legal recourse, and we don't know how to do that really, especially if the perpetrator is anonymous. And just there was no imagination almost. I don't want to say they're not imaginative, I'm sure they are, but in their positions, there was no imagination for what support might look like in addition to, or outside of simply, we're going to send this to police. And I think that's a pretty major issue too, because obviously we want to maintain freedom of speech in Canada for everyone, right? And obviously, to me anyway, like there are going to be the very faculty that they recognize were targeted and suffered disproportionate effects would be those faculty who might not feel comfortable going to the police for a multitude of reasons. And so, within that, I think, yes, I mean, we need maybe more flexible legal structures, but we also need to think about, well, if this problem is not going to go away, how do we mitigate in other ways? How do we support in other ways in addition to legal recourse?
I was just going to jump in and say one thing, because that it makes me think of this is personal and anecdotal story about it. But I'll start with, I think that the Australian e-safety commissioner is such an interesting model because it's so focused on education, but it also means that the education that they're pushing is being driven by evidence. It's the studies, it's what you've both been emphasizing is important, and I'm seeing it in my own life. I have a teenage daughter, and she came home from grade 9 recently, just raging about the education they received about intimate image abuse, because it was, obviously we've had many conversations about these issues, and it was about, victim blaming and blaming the individuals that happens to you, and you should not share it in the first place. And I thought, the teachers are so overwhelmed, and they're wonderful, but they aren't well placed to be having these conversations. But even when they bring in the educators, or bring somebody in who's supposedly specialists, they're again emphasizing the same things, that this is a crime, it's scaring people. These are the wrong, like the conversations we're having right now, we have to be having in so many different places. We need to be taking it to the public libraries, to the middle schools, and so
on. I would like to go back to the notion of freedom of expression that Jaigris raised, because the question of freedom of expression, I guess, is it's multifaceted in a sense that it's at the core of the hate crime. And I think that discussion has to be raised also, because everything is not about freedom of expression. At one point, there's some limit to it, and I think that we have to look at it to that. Hate crime has to be looked at it, and there's some decision of the Supreme Court to look at that in the sense of looking at the right of a minority and the notion of freedom of expression. So it's not an open bar freedom of expression. It's something that is limited, and we have to don't forget about it, because people have a tendency to say, I'm free to say whatever, but that's not the reality in a society that is multiculturalist, and that we want to foster like an open conversation, and I will open the floor because I don't want to go further on that. And there's another notion that I want to put on the table, is the notion of online hate as a way to mob people. Also, the notion of mobbing and online hate, because when you look at the mechanism of mobbing, it's the same that online hate, and the result and the effect on people are the same. So those are the two notions that I love to hear you discussed. So, well, I open the floor for those discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. And I like to think of it as freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach, right? So yeah, I mean, you can say whatever, you know, you want and hopefully not land in jail just for speech in Canada, right? That's what we're hoping. But should that person be given a megaphone? You know, no, absolutely not. And should that person not face any consequences at all? Like often freedom of speech I find is weaponized by especially the right to say, like, if I push back, so, you know, if I say, you know, no, you're being racist, then, you know, they throw their hands up and they say, no, freedom of speech, don't oppress me. And I'm like, well, that's not how freedom of speech works. But also the platforms do have a role to play in this freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach, because they are giving people a megaphone. And, you know, Elon Musk is a great example of when he invited everybody back onto Twitter. And he did that because there was profit to be made. There was, you know, the engagement algorithms shoot up when you have some far-right provocateurs on Twitter causing trouble. And that is a major problem that we need to unpack, is the profitability of online hate. Because I don't think we're really having those conversations in a substantive way in Canada. So those online mobs, right? Some of it is bot activity, of course, but a lot of it is people interacting on a site like Twitter, which is engagement. And engagement is what makes you the money, because that's what gives you the eyeballs for the advertisers. And that like, there's just so many, you know, big red flags there. And I also sometimes, this is a little of an oversimplification, but I like to think about how if I walk into a restaurant and I start yelling racist or sexist slurs at customers of the restaurant, the manager of the restaurant is in full rights to kick me out, and probably should, to maintain their business. So why don't we see some of these platforms as similar, right? Why isn't Twitter or Facebook, you know, like that restaurant where people get kicked out if they're causing pain and trauma to everybody else? And I don't know the answer, but yeah, you're right to flag that free speech absolutism as a defense that is misused, I think, but used to justify some of the worst behavior.
Oh, I mean, I just love what you said, Jaigris, about how we have to recognize how hate speech and misogyny and all of these things are profitable. And maybe that's the big difference between the restaurant example, is that for the restaurant owner, you coming in and saying those things is probably going to drive business away. Whereas exactly like you say on social media, it actually attracts attention. And this is also something I've been thinking a lot about is, so I don't know if everyone heard today the news about, Andrew Tate, who's going to go to jail. And, you know, I find this really difficult as a researcher because I want to know what he says, but I also don't want to Google him or give him more views. I don't want to be like adding to the profitability for him. So this is also a challenge. It's something I'm really thinking about. How can I study, you know, these communities without actually contributing to making them more visible? And maybe just the final thing is, you know, we have to really have a critical eye towards the business model, recognizing for social media platforms, their only incentive really is about creating a profit for their shareholders. And so what we have to do, I think, is be creative and think about, is there a way where we can hit them where it hurts in terms of the profit? That's the only way they're going to make change, because not to say that these social media companies, for the most part, aren't, you know, most of the employees probably want to do good. They're probably not terrible people, but fundamentally their job is to make sure that the platform is profitable. And unless that structure changes, which I don't think it is going to change, we have to think of ways, well, how can we make it so that advertisers are not going to want to advertise on these platforms? And there was a really wonderful campaign in the UK a few years ago on Facebook, where there was a lot of groups that were developed or devoted to promoting violence against women. And so what campaigners did was they started screenshotting the advertisements that appeared next to these groups and started emailing the advertisers and saying, do you know that your product is being advertised next to this group? And the advertisers then went to Facebook and said, this is unacceptable, this has to change. And it was at that point that Facebook actually changed some of their terms, their guidance and their guidelines. So same thing, I think, with these social media companies. Are there creative ways that we can get them to make changes? Because they're not just going to do it on their own. And this idea that they will is really problematic and really naive.
I mean, this is fascinating, because I think then one thing I think through is maybe what the public understanding of the law is, but also what the limits of the law are. So it's not published yet, but with the School of Public Policy and University of Calgary, we did this big study on misinformation and disinformation. And I threw in a few questions on legal misinformation. In particular, I think we all were following when I followed the convoy, and we're seeing this sort of, and there's some really interesting literature too about, there really is a political aspect to the charter, and that charter rights have in a way now been co-opted by the idea of just freedom in it of itself. And so, I mean, freedom of expression is probably a foundational right in our charter. It is critical to engagement of democracy and protecting. It's supposed to, at its best, be protecting marginalized groups to be able to participate and not be kind of weighed down under the thumb of majority groups. But it has been co-opted by this sort of freedom narrative. And the study that we were finding was that I think it was about 30% of those surveyed believed that charter rights were absolute and could not be limited. All charter rights can be limited. We have Section 1 of the charter that says that, and but it is really this American sensibility of what our rights are about. And I think that's something too that's not understood always by the general public, and I'd even say lawyers who aren't practicing in the area, is that all rights in the charter are equal. And so we have the right to freedom of expression. It is not absolute, and it can be limited in some pretty important scenarios, but also if it is conflicting with other rights, like the right to equality, for example, the right to privacy, then you have to examine and weigh these rights as against each other. So yeah, the rights can be mutually reinforcing, but in fact, equality is a really important sort of other dimension to this. And I think what I want to add too is that we have the right to freedom of thought and opinion. And that's a key charter right. It's been talked about as a forgotten freedom. And it's really important here in the different ways when you're talking about the advertising system, the sort of profit motive, the role of algorithms and recommender systems that are really disrupting our ability to form these thoughts. This is sort of an underanalyzed charter right. But we're going to have to wait to see where this goes, because I do want to add one other dimension to this, is that the charter only applies to government action. So it doesn't actually apply to what social media do. So if government passes legislation that implicates social media, it's going to come up there, but it could come up in some really odd ways. Like if we pass online safety legislation and it's forcing social media companies to maybe remove certain types of content or manage it in certain ways, they have to put up warning labels. This might be a form of compelled speech. Oh, pardon me. That is my daughter calling me, and I thought I had that muted. Could you all hear that ringing? And that's a form of compelled speech. And so that actually might cause at least charter scrutiny, because that's the social media's charter rights. And I think that the other thing to think through is what we think the government's responsibility is then in how it manages social media companies. I mean, under international human rights, governments have an obligation to protect rights even between private parties, so between social media and people. That really hasn't been developed in Canadian law. Like our charter case law is much more conservative than that. I don't think it complies with international human rights law, but I think there's a real case to say to the government, you actually need to step up here. You need to protect these rights, equality rights, privacy rights, and so on. And I'll leave that there. Thanks. We haven't talked about mobbing yet too much, but we can circle back.
So do we want to speak a bit about the relationship with hate crime and mobbing? For me, it's the same dynamic. But do you want to discuss that? Are you interested in to discuss that?
Yeah, sure. I was waiting to see if Emily wanted to jump in. Yeah, I know, and I think you're right, Tamara, to bring that up, because mobbing is a tactic, right, that is often used in spreading online hate. quite effectively. And when we've talked to people about the gender-based online abuse that they receive, we've heard reports of just like, it comes so hard, so fast, and I can't manage it. And that's when people generally switch to tactics like, getting family and friends to step in. But, we really need a better mechanism for controlling that than just having family and friends step in to block and report. I mean, that's like a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, if you will. But I do think that mobbing is an interesting case study because it is something that is going to be made infinitely easier by AI. It's already been made infinitely easier by the use of bots, or what we call cyborgs, which is where a human creates bots to sort of help spread their message farther and faster. So this combination, right, between like human writing of the negative tweets and then bots piling on to spread similar content, and then more humans piling on, because once something picks up, right, it starts to trend. And once it starts to trend, more people can see it. And so it could start with maybe one or a handful of people who are writing scripts for bots. And then from there, it just escalates once it becomes a trending topic on one of these sites. So yes, as a tool for hate, it is particularly egregious, and it is often used, in conjunction with other tactics, as a tool of like international meddling, right? So that like the Internet Research Authority, for one example, in Russia, will design these campaigns and target key issues, especially issues like Black Lives Matter, right? Which there are very strong emotions around in North America, and then they will start to poke at people on both sides of the issue in such a way that then, as a result, real people get targeted with online hate because they're associated with the actual versions of these movements, not like the astroturfed versions of these movements coming from other countries. And that's used as a tactic to destabilize, right? And on a political scale, on a global scale. And yet, real people and their families are caught in the crossfire with often, very material results. So threats on life, threats on liberty. People who then are radicalized and go into mosques, for example, and shoot people, right? Like I think because of all of the ideas that we've mentioned previously and that were mentioned in the previous panel, vis-a-vis online does not stay online. We need to be very concerned about tactics like mobbing, which then use the affordances of the technology to attract global attention, which is then laser focused on people and causes great pain and suffering.
I might add to that. I was obsessed with online mobs and online shaming for quite a while. I wrote a article about that one, and it was trying to figure out where that tipping point is. It is, I think, one of the biggest issues we have to deal with here. And there's like the foreign interference that Jaigris was talking about. And there's also just the way that these attacks go viral, and it's brutal. And it strips individuals of their dignity. And I think that one of the interesting kind of dynamics here is that, a lot of some of at least the internet kind of soft governance had been through the communities regulating themselves and calling out bad behavior. And so it's figuring out, well, where's that tipping point that it becomes this governance issue where there needs to be intervention by the company or other types of legal interventions that force the companies to do something there. And I think there's that tipping point where it attacks the dignity of individuals, where companies maybe can put in place certain technical measures, whether it's just like minimizing the number of times messages are shared, whether they can see spikes in content to kind of intervene. Those are just sort of like band-aids though, right? To this bigger issue about the way that mob mentality is I guess being used against particular individuals and groups.
So I guess that we will have to wrap up in a few minutes. So I would like to ask you, a question, like with respect to, we understand that digital technology are a key facilitator on online harassment, misogyny noire, misogyny and racism and whatever, but can those digital technology be part of the solution? So in a more like sunny way, if there's any.
Oh, I always love to be optimistic. Of course, they can be part of the solution, but it can't just, it has to be driven by different governance, there has to be a real will. I think perhaps change in the funding structure or the profit structure of these companies. I don't think we can assume that digital technologies will just become the solution. I was talking to someone recently the other day because I'm really interested in, this AI and all the developments, but thinking we need to really think carefully about how this technology, which can bring so many benefits, but how could also be used to harass women. So, Emily, you were talking about the use of air tags. I'm sure when Apple was designing air tags, they weren't thinking about the role it could be playing in cyberstalking, but we need people to think about the role that it can play in cyberstalking. So maybe I'll say, I think what we really also need to do is make sure that in universities, people who are developing the technology, we shouldn't just be hiring people who are good coders. We need to be hiring sociologists. We need to be hiring people who are thinking about the broader implications of how these technologies can be used. And I think that won't solve or kind of stop all of the harm, but I think that's a really important thing that we need to be doing.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I would add that I think technology absolutely is a key part of this solution. And I think that the companies can innovate some of these solutions, and some are doing some really interesting measures. But the biggest issue is that there's no accountability for it and there's no transparency. And so what I think, what I'd like to see is basically, it's like, well, show us. There is a regulator that says, show us what steps you're taking to address this. What are you doing? And that has the power to be able to investigate and audit that and pose fines. And transparency obligations that aren't just really a form of marketing, but I think one of the best moves was in Europe, where they've basically created transparency or data access rights for particular vetted individuals, whether they're civil society researchers or academics and so on, that actually can look at the data, basically lift the lid and look at the system to be able to then assess what they're doing and assess whether the transparency that they're putting forward is actually reflective of what's going on in the system. So I think that that's sort of the key foundations that will make all the rest of it work.
Yes, I agree with everything that's been said so far. And I also think we have to maybe think how we can scale down our online communities a bit to create communities where we can actively manage, right, and moderate some of this stuff. So what do smaller communities, maybe within some of these larger communities, look like? And I also, this is an event hosted by the Diversity Institute. So I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the role that diversity plays, right? Timnit Gebru, who was the head of AI ethics at Google, was fired. And we should not be firing people like that. We should be hiring more diverse people, women of color specifically, who can be aware of these issues so that we're not producing more unintended consequences from technologies, but we have people around the table saying, oh, but wait, right? If I have a tracker on me at all times, my stalker could find me, or people with the lived experience to be able to catch these things and say, okay, well, let's create a more humane technology. Let's create a technology that builds these communities, and let's create a technology that isn't optimized for spreading hate. So more diversity around the table, I think, would help.
It's interesting what you say, because 2 weeks ago, I was at the UN with the discussion with respect to people from African descent. And I was able to talk about a resolution that I was asking to put put Afro-descendant women in the center of AI development, and I was thinking about the woman that you were referring to in Google, because she whistle blow and the whistle blowing would go back straight to her face. She lost her job. But so I find it very interesting that you raise it, because when I was at the UN talking about human rights without talking about AI, it's an illusion now. We need to speak both languages to be able to manage the future, because if we are not doing that, we're just like missing the boat. So thank you very much for the conversation. It was a delight to speak to some so strong, opinionated women, and it's a compliment. Sometimes it's seen as badly, but it's a compliment. So thank you very much for that time. It was a pleasure to share that moment with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tamara. And we're really very lucky to have had 3 Canada Research Chairs in this panel. So Jaigris, Kaitlynn, Emily, to all of you, thank you for such a rich discussion and such important points raised, like the ways in which this deployment of technology facilitated gender and sexual based violence and the harassment as well. And as well as the misogynistic and anti-2S LGBTQ+ discourse has really deep individual implications, as well as how it erodes democratic communication, for example. Also how the harassment and violence connects to other spheres. The examples of if you will, the political economy of misogyny, and how this violence and discourse really raises complex questions about how do we engage with law, how do we engage with the state in responding to it. And finally, also how these online spaces, a very interesting point, how online spaces are in many senses an amplifier of other broader cultural elements, or perhaps a better analogy is a magnifying mirror as we look at ourselves as our society in these online spaces. But also importantly, at the end, there we touched a bit on potentially technology being a source of solutions. So thank you again for all of that really, really rich discussion.